Chapter 24, the Fungi Kingdom. Various fungi can come in many colors and shapes. They can be unicellular or multicellular organisms, but all of them are made of eukaryotic cells. Remember that to be a eukaryotic cell, you need to have a nucleus with a membrane, you need to have DNA with histone proteins, you need to have endoplasmic reticulum and mitochondria and Golgi, and that's common to all eukaryotes, as we saw with the protists. Now, for the fungi, they have no chloroplasts. So even though some of the fungi may appear colored, it's not because they are able to photosynthesize. So keep that in mind. Additionally, all fungi have a cell wall, and they are non-motile, meaning they don't have flagella on their cells, but some do have flagella on their spores. Now, when we take a look at the characteristics of the fungi, we see that there are a number, over 80,000 species in the fungi kingdom. Most of them are in fact multicellular, but we do have some unicellular examples. They are heterotrophic meaning that they have to consume previously living organic matter. And the way that they obtain this is not through eating like we do, but rather the cells of the fungi release their digestive enzymes onto their food. Almost like they spit out their digestive enzymes onto their food digests, and then they absorb the broken down nutrient molecules into their cells. So this is different from us, where we have our digestive enzymes inside in our stomach. They have digestive enzymes that they release outside their bodies and onto their food. Most of them are saprobes, which are organisms that eat decaying matter. The sap part means rotting, and many of them are actually parasitic. Several fungi exist in what we call mutualistic relationships, which is a symbiotic living with arrangement. And if it's mutualistic, it means that both parties benefit, mutual. So they often are found living with plants, but sometimes animals. And if it's mutualistic, it means both parties will benefit. And interestingly, the biggest organism on the earth is a fungus. On the west coast of this country, there is a mushroom that is thousands of acres large. So talking about the evolution of fungi and what we know about this, we know from our talk about the protists that animals, plants, and fungi, those three kingdoms, all can look back to the protists as a common ancestor. Now, we can look and see that animals and fungi have a common ancestor that was a protist after the plants broke off. So animals and fungi are more closely related than fungi and plants. Additionally, we think that some flagellated, meaning having a flagellum, unicellular protist was most likely the common ancestor for animals and fungi, but we don't know exactly which one was the ancestor for the fungi directly. Now, the evolution is hard to track because the bodies of fungi are often soft, and it's very hard for them to become fossilized. There's no real hard parts to a fungus. We do think that probably fungi evolved somewhere more than 450 million years ago. And we do have fossil evidence of the presence of mycorrhizae, which are fungi symbionts that live with plants. So in some plant fossils, we have seen evidence of mycorrhizae, which would be the fungus component. Let's take a look at the structure of a fungus. The body of the fungus is called the thallus, and it is mostly composed of a multicellular mycelium. Mycelium is a network of strands, which are called hyphae. So the hyphae is one individual little string, and all the hyphae together is a mycelium. Now these hyphae can be multicellular if they're septate, meaning the hyphae have little divisions, and there's a picture coming up that shows that, and each little division is a unicellular division. Or the hyphae could be non-septate, meaning it's one big hyphae, lots of nuclei all together. And the hyphae grow at the tips. So this would be sort of the branching body, and the hyphae are growing out, and they do their most growing at the tips. Now, the majority of the mycelium will be underground. So you may have seen these out in the damp forest. If you turn over some dirt, or even in your yard, if you have bark mulch and you turn it over and you see this white network of strands underneath, that is a mycelium of a fungus. Now, each of the cells of the fungus has a cell wall, and the cell wall is made of a material called chitin, and this chitin is the same material that makes up the exoskeleton, or the outer shell of insects. Now notice that this is a different material than makes up the cell wall of plants. Plant cell walls are made of cellulose, and that's one of the pieces of evidence that we know that fungi are not closely related to the plants, even though for a long time fungi were put into the plant kingdom thinking they must be like plants. Now, any excess food that the fungi absorbs up that it doesn't need, they can store it in a storage form of glucose, which is called glycogen, and this is the same molecule that animals use to store their excess glucose. Another piece of evidence to say that fungi are closer to animals than they are to plants. Now, the growth of a fungus depends again on whether it's unicellular or multicellular. So here we have a single-celled fungus, which is the yeast. This is one yeast cell, one organism, and we can tell that it is a unicellular fungus because each cell has its own nucleus. So when this cell needs to reproduce, it mostly reproduces by just breaking a piece off called budding. A little section kind of blebs off of the original cell and makes a new yeast. And this would be an asexual mechanism of reproduction. There's no new genetic material in that new yeast. Now, if it's a multicellular fungus, and here's an example, as I mentioned before, these are each individual hyphae, each strand, and all together it makes a mycelium. If it's septated, that means there's division points, and you see a nucleus in each little section. If it's non-septated, there's none of those divisions, and each one of these is a nucleus, so this is a multinucleated one big cell. So when these fungi need to reproduce, keep in mind that they are haploid. These nuclei are haploid. So these can go through either asexual reproduction, or they can join nuclei together, adjacent nuclei, and form a diploid nucleus and go through sexual reproduction. But it's not the same sexual reproduction that we see in the animal kingdom. So let's dive into the reproduction itself. So here we have a generalized reproductive cycle for a fungus. There's a number of these that are shown in the chapter, but we're going to focus only on this one general figure. So, both sexual and asexual reproduction can occur in the fungi kingdom. The sexual reproduction involves 3 stages. So if we take a look here, we're going to start with the mycelium. Here, we just saw that in the previous slide. This is the body of the fungus, and it is haploid. Every cell has only one copy of the chromosomes. Now, if we want to undergo asexual reproduction, we are merely going to divide the cells of the body, produce small segments called spores, release those spores, those are haploid, and those spores then travel to a different place, germinate, means start to grow, and form a new mycelium somewhere else. That's asexual reproduction, no changing up of the genetic material. When the fungus reproduces sexually, so that's on the bottom half, we see that what happens is we first go through a process. So we start with the haploid, the hyphae form, that's right here. We have plasmogamy, which is an interesting word, where 2 haploid cells from the mycelium fuse together from actually 2 mycelium. So you have another mycelium. So you have a haploid cell from one and a haploid cell from another mycelium fused together. So here is the one from here, and this red one came from a different mycelium, so different genetics. They're going to fuse together in a single cell, and that is called plasmogamy. Now this is a heterokaryotic stage, so meaning there are 2 nuclei. Then we go through karyogamy, where the 2 nuclei fuse, come together, and form a diploid nucleus, and we have what we call a zygote. So now we have 2 copies of every chromosome right here. This zygote then undergoes meiosis to form haploid spores. So spores are always haploid. These haploid spores will have a mix of the genetics from this zygote and will not look like the original parent, either this parent or the parent that donated the red nucleus. So we'll have spores. Spores will then be released and set up somewhere else and form a new fungus body. Now, keep in mind that these are for most fungi that can undergo both asexual and sexual reproduction. Some, like the unicellular yeast, reproduce only asexually. So here we have a picture. This is one hyphae that is going to release spores. So this would be the asexual reproduction. And so we have what's called a sporangium on the end of the hyphae, and this hyphae is called a sporangiophore. It's a special name for this hyphae that has a spore-releasing structure on the end of it. So this is releasing haploid spores in an asexual mode of reproduction, and it happens to be from a mold. Now, there are 5 phyla which we are going to be looking at in the kingdom fungi. So remember, phylum is the division after the kingdom. So we have kingdom fungi, and then we move into the phylum. So the first one are the Zygomycetes, or the phylum Zygomycota. And these organisms are mainly saprotrophs, so they are decomposing animal and plant remains. They reproduce sexually and asexually. And one common example that we see is the black bread mold. So the Rhizopus stolonifer, which is the black bread mold right here. Additionally, we have a blue mold that we can see on this particular bread as well. Now, there's a small number of these zygomycota, and they, some of them, most of them are harmless, but some of them can be parasites. Our second phylum is the ascomycota. You notice that they all have myco in there. Myco is the prefix meaning fungi. So these are called the sac fungi, and there's about 60,000 species of sac fungi, including the yeasts and the molds. So this is a very large group. Most of them are the saprotrophs, and that meaning that they are going to be decomposers, and they can digest lots of key chemicals like cellulose, lignin, which is in wood, and collagen, which is in animal tissues. So they're very important for breaking down these materials. Most of the hyphae are septate, meaning they have separations between their nuclei. We also see in the ascomycota group the morels and the truffles. Now, these are not chocolate candies. These are structures that look like mushrooms, but they are, in fact, here's some truffles and some morels. So these are fungi that are considered gourmet delicacies. And additionally, there are some ascomycota which can cause plant diseases like powdery mildews, ergot, which is the chemical that grows on rye grain and is believed to have been the chemical that caused the hallucinations in the people of Salem, Massachusetts during the witch trials. There are also some tree diseases, chestnut blight, and Dutch elm disease, which are caused by fungi of the ascomycota group. And lastly, Aspergillus and Candida. So these can cause some serious human infections, mycoses or fungal infections. This we see in the baby's mouth is a candida infection, which is called thrush, and you see these cottony white growths. Now, the sac fungi, the ascomycota, can undergo either asexual or sexual reproduction. Asexual is the most common form. And remember, yeasts are in this group, and they reproduce by budding. So here we have a yeast cell, which a bit of it is just bulging off, and that will become a new yeast cell. And others will reproduce by just producing spores called candida. So here is the spore formation, asexual formation, which just comes from breaking off by producing bits of material from the hyphae and having those produce new individuals through spore production, and there's no new genetic material in there. Now, the ascomycota can go through sexual reproduction. The haploid hyphae, just like we saw in the bottom half of that diagram, the haploid hyphae will fuse together to make a diploid nucleus, and then that diploid nucleus undergoes meiosis and makes spores, and then those spores can produce new ascomycota. Now, some of the sac fungi, the ascomycota, are molds, and some of them can be very helpful to humans. Aspergillus is a group of green molds which can be used to produce soy sauce through fermentation of soybeans. Also, the penicillium, which are blue molds, are the source of the antibiotic that we call penicillin. So this is a mold it makes an antibiotic that will kill bacteria. So here it's a mold that's the mold is only trying to keep itself safe from the bacteria. It wasn't making penicillin for us, but we figured out that this mold was making something that could kill bacteria, and we decided we would use that in treatment of humans who had bacterial illness. Now, yeast can also be both beneficial or harmful to humans. The Saccharomyces cerevisiae are added to grape juice to make wine. So the yeast will ferment, and they'll turn sugars into ethanol and carbon dioxide, and that makes our wine. And also some yeasts can be used in genetic engineering experiments. We know that yeasts are fairly simplistic organisms. They're easy to grow and easy to keep, so therefore they make great model organisms to use for research. But on the other hand, yeast like the Candida albicans is the one that causes fungal infections, like the thrush that we saw in the baby's mouth in the previous slide. And also, these infections can take root in AIDS patients, which have a depressed immune system. We're going to move on to group 3, the Basidiomycota. These are called the club fungi, and we know them most often as mushrooms. Now, there's other things besides mushrooms in this group. There's 22,000 different species of Basidiomycota, which include toadstools, bracket fungi, puffballs, stinkhorns, and other structures. But they all produce, as their reproductive structure, this similar type of visual. So this, what we call a mushroom, is actually the reproductive structure when the Basidiomycota wants to reproduce sexually. The body of the mushroom is all below the ground, the body of this Basidiomycota, and this is its reproductive structure, which only shows up when it wants to go through sexual reproduction. Now, in this group, we also have some fungi that cause plant diseases such as smuts and rusts. And the mycelium, which is under the ground, the body of the fungus, is made of septate hyphae, the ones with the divisions. Now, these fungi usually reproduce sexually. So when they produce a club-like structure, a quote-unquote mushroom, this is when the Basidiomycota is reproducing sexually. The haploid hyphae fuse together. They form a 2-nucleus mycelium, and then it forms the fruiting body called a mushroom. In the mushroom, there are structures, spore-like structures called basidia, and through meiosis, we can make lots of basidia spores, many. So these are found in the gills of the mushroom cap. Our next group are called the Glomeromycota. The Glomeromycota, this is a fairly small group. There's only 160 species. So these are fungi that produce structures called mycorrhizae. The myco stands for fungus, and the rhizae stands for roots. So they form a mutualistic association between the fungi and the roots of plants. So they used to be classified as zygomycota, but now they're in their own separate group based on DNA data that we now know that they are classified differently. So these two form a mutualistic grouping, so that means that both are going to benefit. Here's an example in the group, lichens. Lichens are a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and either a cyanobacterium, which is a bacteria, or a green algae, which is a protist. So there is a relationship between these two organisms, either the fungus and a cyanobacterium, or the fungus and the green algae. In this relationship, the fungus provides a home, a place for either the bacteria or the algae, and the bacteria or the algae produces nutrients through photosynthesis, because both the cyanobacterium and the green algae can photosynthesize, so they can make food. So they make food which they can transfer to the fungus. So this is why it's mutualistic. The fungus provides a home for the bacteria, the algae. The bacteria and the algae provide food for the fungus, which cannot photosynthesize. And here's a diagram showing the body structure of the lichen. So all of this web-like structure is all the mycelium of the fungus, and then all these little circles here are either the cyanobacteria, that's where the cyanobacteria or the green algae live. So when we look at these symbiotic relationships, the mycorrhizae, remember the myco stands for the fungus part and the rhizae for the root part, we see that the mutualistic relationships between soil fungus and the roots of plants. So we see that in this situation, there's a mutualistic relationship between a fungus and a plant. So before, in the lichen, we saw it was a mutualistic relationship between the fungus and either a green algae or a cyanobacteria. Now we're seeing a mutualistic relationship between a fungus and the roots of plants. So this can greatly increase the absorptive surface, so the plants can pick up more nutrients from the soil that they need, the materials they need for the soil through the mycorrhizae. So that is the help that the fungus gives to the plant. It can help it pick up nitrogen and other minerals, and therefore then the plant can give the fungus some food. And our very last group are called the chytridiomycota, and this is a very primitive group of fungi. Probably the very first fungi were from this group. And it was probably about 500 million years ago. A shortened version are the chytrids, chytridiomycotas. They're found everywhere. Like all fungi, they release digestive enzymes that break down organic material, and when this particular group does that, they can often cause disease. So there's a group of chytrids which affect amphibians like this frog, and they live on the frog's surface, essentially eating the frog as they go. They're all microscopic, and they produce motile spores called zoospores. So the spores of these chytrids have flagella. So they're the only spores in the fungi group that have a flagellum. All of the chytrids are unicellular, and as I mentioned, some of them can in fact cause disease. Now, these were originally placed in the protist kingdom for a long time because they were probably the very first fungi members. And so they kind of look like protists that evolved from protists. So fungi exist in our ecosystems, and they play some very important roles. One of those roles is as a decomposer. So it's very important to break down dead material into its units so that other living material can utilize them. And decomposers are very important. We've seen decomposers in the bacteria kingdom, and we see decomposers in the fungi. There are two greatest groups of decomposers, and they are going to help break down dead material so that this material can be recycled. Here we see that some of these decomposers can live on living material and break it down. So these shelf mushrooms are in fact eating the outer layers of this tree. And we find that there are fungi everywhere. And here we see some symbiotic homes. So this is where fungi are living with either cyanobacteria or algae in that lichen form. Here we find some lichens on a gravestone. Here we find some on a tree, and even just on the ground. So you can find these lichens everywhere in the ecosystem. Now, unfortunately, some of our fungi partners will cause disease in plants, so some plant pathogens, and these can impact crops by molding material, and they can decrease the shelf life of some of our foods, so they can have some real economic disadvantage. Additionally, some fungi can cause animal diseases. So here is an example. This is ringworm. It's found on the skin, and it's found in a circular pattern. It used to be that people thought this was caused by an actual worm, which is an animal, but in fact it's caused by a fungus and can be treated with antifungal agents. And we see that some fungi can actually be utilized in agriculture as bioinsecticides. So this is the emerald ash borer. It's an insect that is killing a lot of ash trees, and it is being attacked by a parasitic fungus. So we found that we can spray infected ash trees with this particular fungus, and you can see it growing on this emerald ash borer, and it will kill the insect. And our last impact of fungi are that they are a great food group. So we actually consume a lot of fungi in the form of truffles, and also as mushrooms. And we also use fungi to produce lots of products like beer, wine, cheese, and bread. And so that will conclude our chapter 24.